What would you do if you caught one of your own employees eating trash just to survive? Inside the company you built from nothing. James Carter faced that question on a chilly March morning in 2025, his first day undercover as Tom, a new trainee at his own warehouse. He'd slipped in the break room, expecting the usual hum of tired workers grabbing a quick bite after hours of hauling boxes. Instead, he saw something that stopped him cold. A young kid, Tommy Hayes, he'd learn later, sat alone near the vending machine, his sunken eyes darting around like he was hiding a secret. The kid was maybe 20 tops, with a mop of messy brown hair and a uniform 2 sizes too big, hanging off his skinny frame like a scarecrow's rags. Then, quick as a cat, Tommy glanced over his shoulder, slipped to the trash bin by the wall, and fished out half a sandwich wrapped in greasy paper. He peeled it open slow, like a man unboxing a treasure, turning it in his trembling hands to check for mold or stains. Satisfied, he took a small bite, chewing with a quiet desperation that hit Jim square in the chest. 50 years of hard living, building a business, raising a family, weathering storms, hadn't prepared him for this. This wasn't just hunger. This was a crack in the foundation of everything he'd worked for, and he needed to know how deep it ran. The warehouse squatted on the edge of town, a good 50 miles from headquarters, a hulking maze of concrete and steel where no one would recognize the CEO's face. Jim had picked this spot on purpose, the farthest outpost of his empire, the one most likely to show him the unvarnished truth. Inside, it was a madhouse. Cardboard boxes teetered in sloppy piles, some split open with their guts spilling out, canned goods, cheap toys, bundles of socks. Forklifts roared through the aisles, their drivers weaving reckless paths, horns blaring like angry geese. The air stank of sweat, diesel, and something sour like hope gone stale. Workers shuffled through the chaos, heads down, shoulders slumped. Some moved like machines, scanning and stacking with dead-eyed precision. Others muttered under their breath, curses about sore backs, late checks, or the boss who rode them like mules. Jim watched it all, a knot tightening in his gut. 10 years ago, he'd started this company with nothing but a beat-up truck and handshake. Back then, he was the one loading crates, charming clients over coffee, driving through snowstorms to make a delivery. Now, with 12 warehouses stretching across the state, he spent his days in boardrooms, sipping lukewarm coffee while staring at spreadsheets and listening to suits drone on about profit margins. He'd trusted his managers to keep the operation humming. Frank Wheeler here, others elsewhere. But lately, the cracks were showing. Customer complaints had been piling up for months. Shipments arriving 3 days late, boxes crushed like they'd been drop-kicked, drivers snapping at folks on their porches. Employee turnover was through the roof. Good people walked out faster than he could hire replacements. Efficiency reports showed red flags, output dropping even as costs climbed. Yet the revenue stayed strong, a shiny number that kept the board happy. His regional managers waved it off in their slick emails. Just a rough patch, Jim. We've got it under control. But Jim wasn't born yesterday. 50 years old, gray creeping into his temples. He'd learned to trust his gut over polished lies. Something was off, badly off, and he wasn't about to sit in his cushy office waiting for another memo. So he'd shaved his neat beard, swapped his tailored suit for an old hoodie and faded jeans, and stuck a pair of thick-rimmed glasses on his nose. He'd applied as Tom Carter, a nobody trainee, at the warehouse where no one knew him. If he was going to fix this, he needed to see it with his own eyes. The hiring process was a joke. He'd walked in expecting at least a handshake and a rundown, maybe a safety video or a quick tour. Instead, Frank Wheeler, the shift supervisor, barely glanced up from his clipboard. Frank was a bull of a man, thick neck, thicker gut, with a permanent scowl etched into his leathery face. "You the new guy?" he grunted, voice like gravel. Jim nodded. Frank tossed him a scanner, a scratched-up handheld thing that beeped faintly. "Stick with the crew, don't screw up. Sort inventory with those guys over there." He jerked his thumb toward a cluster of workers near the loading dock, then stomped off, boots thudding on the concrete. No training, no background check, not even a welcome aboard. Jim squared his shoulders and joined the team, blending in as best a 50-year-old rookie could. That's where he first saw Tommy, hustling twice as fast as the others, hauling boxes with a frantic energy despite the exhaustion dragging at his steps. The kid flinched every time Frank's shadow loomed near, like he'd been burned one too many times. Jim kept quiet, watching, filing away every detail. Lunch came after 4 hours of backbreaking work, sorting, stacking, scanning until his arms ached. Jim grabbed a coffee from a machine that spat out something closer tar, then found a spot near the back of the break room. The place was a dump, cracked linoleum floors, flickering fluorescent lights, a microwave that hummed like it was on its last legs. Most workers pulled out packed lunches, ham sandwiches, cold leftovers, or heated up instant noodles, the smell of salty broth mixing with the stale air. Tommy sat alone, though, staring at the vending machine with its overpriced chips and candy bars. Jim could almost hear the kid's stomach growl from across the room. Then came the trash bin moment, the one that turned Jim's world upside down. He waited till Tommy swallowed that first pitiful bite, then walked over, keeping his voice low and steady. "Hey man, you okay?" Tommy froze, sandwich halfway to his mouth, panic flashing in his eyes. I wasn't stealing," he stammered, voice cracking. "It was thrown out already." Jim's chest tightened like a vice. "You don't have food?" Tommy shrugged, staring at the floor. "Payday's Friday. Just gotta make it till then." His hollow tones said it all. This wasn't new, wasn't rare. Before Jim could dig deeper, Frank barged in, boots pounding. "Hayes, break's over, move your ass." Tommy crammed the sandwich into his pocket, nodded quick, and scurried off, head bowed. Jim watched him disappear into the warehouse shadows, a slow burn igniting in his gut. This wasn't just one kid down on his luck. This was a symptom of something festering. He threw himself into the next few hours, working the floor like any other grunt, sorting boxes, dodging forklifts, scanning labels until his fingers cramped. But his eyes never stopped moving. The warehouse was a pressure cooker. Too few hands, too many orders, every worker stretched to the breaking point. Packages piled up in corners, some marked urgent, yet gathering dust. Frank strutted around like a king, barking orders, "Faster, you lazy bums," but never lifting a finger to help. Jim caught snippets of talk from the crew. "Ain't seen a full check in weeks," one grumbled. "Last guy who complained got his hours cut," another whispered. The pieces clicked together, dark and ugly. Jim's suspicions hardened into a steel resolve. He wasn't walking away. Not yet. Not until he knew how far this rot spread. Was this just one bad shift under one lousy manager? Or had the company he'd poured his soul into turned into something he didn't recognize? He'd built this place to give folks a decent living, not to grind them into the dirt. Now, staring at the chaos, he wasn't so sure. "Hey, folks," Jim muttered under his breath, picturing the YouTube crowd leaning in close. "If you're wondering what I do next, stick around. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss it. I've got a feeling things are about to get wild." James Carter woke up on day 2 with a fire in his belly, the image of Tommy Hayes eating trash seared into his mind. He pulled on the same faded hoodie and jeans, the disguise of Tom, the trainee, settling over him like a second skin. 50 years old, and here he was, back on the warehouse floor like the old days. Only this time, he wasn't hauling boxes for a dream. He was digging for the truth. Frank Wheeler had stuck him with a sorting crew near the loading dock, a ragtag bunch barely holding together under a mountain of work. The warehouse thrummed with its usual madness. Forklifts buzzing like angry wasps, their rusty frames groaning under overloaded pallets. Boxes stacked so high they swayed like drunks. Shouts and curses bouncing off the cavernous walls. Jim's crew was a skeleton. 4 guys total, including Tommy and Ray Mitchell, a wiry 40-something with gray streaking his beard and a limp he tried to hide. The air was thick with dust and the sour tang of sweat, the kind that clung to your skin and wouldn't let go. Jim grabbed a box of canned soup, his shoulders creaking from decades of wear, and ran the scanner over it. The damn thing beeped faint, flickering like it was one jolt from giving up. He glanced around. Tommy hustled double time, sweat dripping despite the early March chill, while Ray moved steady but slow, wincing with every twist. The other guy, a quiet kid with a buzz cut and a bad leg, shuffled along, head down. Too much work, too few bodies, and a crew running on fumes. Every time Frank's boots echoed closer, the tension spiked. Tommy flinched like a startled rabbit. Ray's jaw tightened, and the quiet kid sped up, fear in his eyes. Jim's got twisted. He'd built this company to lift folks up, not grind them down. The first real test hit an hour into the shift, and it came fast. Ray was wrestling a heavy crate, some kind of kitchen gadget, blenders or toasters, judging by the heft, stacked awkwardly on a pile of returns. His hands, calloused from 6 years on the job, slipped just as he shifted its weight. The crate crashed to the floor with a hollow boom, spilling a mess of packaged goods across the concrete. Blenders in cracked plastic, cords tangled like spaghetti. Nothing shattered, just a loud, messy spill, but Frank Wheeler was on it like a shark smelling chum. He stormed over from the supervisor's perch, his thick frame cutting through the chaos, face red and scowling. "Are you serious, Mitchell?" he bellowed, voice rattling the nearby stacks. "You think we got time for this crap?" Ray dropped to his knees, scrambling to gather the pieces, his weathered face tight with a mix of anger and resignation. "It slipped, Frank," he said, voice low but firm. "Ain't nobody hurt. Nothing's broke." Frank loomed over him, hands on hips, his gut straining against his stained polo shirt. "I don't want to hear excuses. That's $50 out of your check. Maybe more if I feel like counting every damn blender." Jim's blood ran hot, the scanner nearly slipping from his grip. $50 for an accident? He stepped forward, keeping his tone even despite the 50 years of grit urging him to swing. "Hold up," he said. "That's not right. It was a mistake. Company ought to cover it." Frank wheeled on him, eyes narrowing to slits. "You got something to say, rookie?" Jim squared his shoulders, meeting the glare head-on. "Just seems fair. Guy's working his tail off, not smashing stuff for fun." Frank barked a laugh, harsh and mean. "Fair? This ain't a charity. You break it, you buy it. That's the rule. Ask Mitchell, he knows." Ray kept his head down, shoving blenders back into the crate. But Jim caught the flash of fury in his eyes, quickly buried. Nobody spoke up. Not Ray, not Tommy, not the quiet kid hovering nearby. They couldn't risk it. Not when every dollar counted. Jim went back to sorting, but his mind was a storm. He stuck close to the crew through the next few hours, ears sharp, picking up fragments of the nightmare he'd walked into. The warehouse was a pressure cooker, orders piled up in corners, some marked priority, but gathering cobwebs, while the crew raced to keep up. Frank strutted the floor like a dictator, barking at anyone who slowed down. "Move it, you lazy bums," but never touched a box himself. Jim caught whispers between the grunts. "Ain't seen a full check since Christmas," Ray muttered once, rubbing his aching back. "Last guy who griped got sent home early, permanently," the quiet kid added, voice barely audible. It wasn't just bad luck or a rough patch. This was a system, cold and deliberate. Then, near shift's end, Jim hit pay dirt. He lingered by the lockers, pretending to fuss with his laces, while Frank and Eddie Brooks jawed near the exit. Eddie, all sharp angles and greasy hair, leaned in with a smirk. "Payroll's cut again this week. Told corporate we had too much overtime." Frank grinned, a predator's flash of teeth. "Yeah, let the suckers hustle harder. Doc Mitchell for that box. Teach him to keep his clumsy mitts steady." Eddie's laugh was a dry rasp. "You're a bastard, Frank." "Damn right." Frank shot back, smug as hell. Jim's fists balled tight in his pockets, nails digging into his palms, but he kept his face blank. Cutting hours to choke the crew? Docking pay out of spite? This wasn't mismanagement. It was a racket, pure and simple. His pulse hammered. What else were these snakes hiding in the dark corners of this place? The shift broke for a breather around 3, a measly 15 minutes to gulp water and stretch aching legs. Jim tracked Tommy down near the loading dock, with a kid slumped against a stack of pallets, staring out at the gray sky. Up close, Tommy looked worse than ever. Dark circles like bruises under his eyes, cheeks sunken like he hadn't eaten a square meal in months. His hands shook faintly, clutching a dented water bottle. Jim eased up beside him, keeping it light. "You holding up okay?" Tommy shrugged, scuffing his sneaker against the concrete. "Same as always." Jim let the silence sit a beat, then pressed gentle. "That thing with Ray, Frank taking his pay, that happened a lot." Tommy let out a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. "Every damn week. Last month, a pallet tipped over. Forklift clipped it. Driver's fault, not mine. Frank pinned it on me anyway. Took half my check, $200, to cover damages." Jim's stomach lurched. "Half? That can't be legal." "It ain't," Tommy said, voice flat as the dock floor. "But you argue you get fewer shifts. Fewer shifts, less money. You figure it out." He kicked a pebble, watching it skitter away. Jim sat beside him, the cold concrete biting through his jeans, 50 years of life weighing heavy. "How'd he get by?" Tommy's eyes flicked away, shame creeping in. "Barely. Rent's late. Power's been off since February. After that sandwich yesterday, I figured I'd hit bottom, but I've been lower." His voice softened, a faint spark flickering. "Keep showing up, though. Gotta eat somehow." Jim nodded slow, a lump rising in his throat. The kid was a fighter, clawing through a hell Jim had let fester. For a moment, he saw a shadow of his younger self in Tommy. Hungry, scrappy, building something from nothing. Maybe there was hope here, buried under the muck, if he could root out the poison choking it. James Carter's third day undercover as Tom started with a dull ache in his bones, 50 years of living catching up as he hauled boxes in the warehouse's relentless grind. He'd spent the morning shadowing Tommy Hayes and Ray Mitchell, the air thick with dust and the rumble of forklifts weaving reckless paths through towering stacks. Jim was piecing it together. Understaffing, dock pay, a crew stretched to snapping. But the real gut punch came around noon, during a rare lull near the water cooler. Tommy was there, gulping from his battered bottle, sweat streaking his pale face despite the March chill. Jim eased up beside him, keeping his voice low, 50 years of instincts on edge. "You said yesterday you've been lower than eating trash. How low are we talking?" Tommy froze, his sunken eyes darting to Jim, then dropping to the cracked concrete like he'd been caught with a live wire. He exhaled slow, shoulders slumping under that baggy uniform. "You really want to know?" Jim nodded, his gut screaming this was the key, the thread to unravel the whole damn mess. Tommy leaned against the wall, voice dropping to a whisper, brittle and raw. "Frank, don't just dock pay. If you're desperate, really desperate, he'll help you out. Gives you an advance, cash in hand. Calls it a favor." Jim's brow furrowed, a cold prickle crawling up his spine. "An advance? Like a loan?" Tommy's jaw clenched, a bitter twist curling his lips. "Yeah, a loan, with interest that'd choke a bank. You fall behind, it doubles, triples. Then your hours get cut, till you're stuck. Can't pay. Can't leave." Jim's pulse hammered, the warehouse noise fading to a dull roar. This wasn't mismanagement. It was a predator's game, a trap spun right under his nose. Frank Wheeler wasn't just a bully. He was a lone shark, fattening himself on the desperation of kids like Tommy. That truth chewed at Jim through the afternoon, a storm of guilt and rage churning in his chest. He kept working, scanning labels, stacking crates, dodging forklifts that screeched too close, but his mind was elsewhere. 50 years old, a decade of sweat poured into this company, and he'd let it rot into a cage. He'd sat in boardrooms, sipping coffee, nodding at polished reports, while Frank turned his warehouse into a personal empire. How many were caught in this web? How had he been so blind? He replayed every detail. Tommy's hollow laugh, Ray's buried anger, the crew's quiet fear, and saw his failure stark and clear. He'd promised jobs, stability, a chance at something better, not this soul-crushing grind. Around 4, he was unloading a truck with Tommy, the kid's arms trembling as he hefted a box of auto parts. Jim watched him struggle, sweat beading on his forehead, and couldn't hold back. "You ever think about walking away?" Tommy shook his head, voice rough as gravel. "Can't. Oh, Frank, $600. Been paying it off since January. I stopped showing up. He'll track me down." Said so himself. Jim's chest tightened, shame washing over him like a cold tide. This was his company, his legacy, and it was shackling this kid to a debt he'd never outrun. Could he tear this mess apart before it broke Tommy and the others for good? The storm peaked around 5 when Frank decided to tighten the screws. Jim was sorting a stack of returns near the loading dock, close enough to hear the shouting over the warehouse din. Frank had cornered Tommy by a pallet of canned goods, his thick finger jabbing the kid's chest like a dagger. "You're 2 weeks late on that advance, Hayes," Frank snarled, his voice booming for all to hear. $800 by Friday, or you're out. No shifts, no nothing." Tommy shrank back, pale as death, his skinny frame trembling under that oversized uniform. I don't have it, Frank. You cut my hours last month. I can't." Frank cut him off, venom dripping from every word. "Not my problem, kid. You took the cash. You owe me. Figure out, beg, borrow. I don't care, or you're done." Jim's blood roared in his ears, 50 years of restraint fraying as he gripped a box tight enough to dent the cardboard. He edged closer, pretending to adjust the stack, and caught Eddie Brooks slinking up beside Frank, that greasy smirk plastered on his face. "Told you he'd fold," Eddie muttered, voice low but smug. Frank grinned, a cold, cruel slash across his leathery face. "Keep him scared, keep him broke. That's how you run this place. They'll never climb out." Jim's hands shook, rage and disbelief colliding. The twist hit hard. Frank wasn't just exploiting them. He was crafting their despair, a puppet master rigging the game to keep them trapped forever. By nightfall, Jim was a wreck, watching Tommy stumble through the last hour like a ghost. The kid was unraveling, eyes glassy, steps unsteady, hauling a box of batteries half his size with arms that shook like leaves in a storm. Jim stayed close, spotting him when he nearly dropped it, and saw the brutal truth. Tommy was past exhaustion, running on fumes in a body that couldn't take much more. Around 8, as the shift wound down, disaster struck. Tommy was crossing the floor to the lockers, dragging his feet when his legs gave out. He tripped, hitting the concrete hard, a dull smack echoing in the quieting warehouse. Jim rushed over, dropping to his knees beside him. "Hey kid, you okay?" Tommy nodded weak, trying to push himself up, but his arms buckled, dark circles stark against his ashen face. "Just tired," he mumbled, voice slurring like a drunk's. Jim grabbed his arm, steadying him, and felt the sharp jut of bone under that baggy sleeve, too thin, too fragile. "You're not tired, you're starving," Jim said, voice cracking with a mix of anger and grief. Tommy didn't argue, just slumped against the lockers, his breath shallow, too spent to even sit straight. Jim's heart sank, a black void swallowing him whole. This was his warehouse, his people, and it was killing this kid, one grueling shift at a time. He had the proof now. Frank's racket, the crew's despair. But could he act fast enough to pull Tommy back from the brink? Or was he too late to save them from the edge Frank had pushed them to? Jim Carter stood in Frank Wheeler's grimy office, the air thick with tension and the faint smell of stale coffee. He'd seen enough, more than enough. 2 days undercover as Tom had ripped the mask off his warehouse, exposing a predator's den with Frank as the wolf. The night before, he'd stayed late, hunched over the office computer, his CEO credentials unlocking a flood of ugly truth. Payroll records glowed on the screen. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned from workers' checks over years. Penalties for drop boxes, late deliveries, even taking an extra minute on break. Tommy's file hit hardest. Hours slashed at random. Pay docked for damages that weren't his fault, leaving him with scraps while he ate from the trash. Jim's hands shook as he shut the laptop, the numbers searing into his brain. He'd let this happen, trusted the wrong people, stayed too long in his ivory tower. 50 years old, and he'd never felt so ashamed. But shame wouldn't fix it. Action would. This ended now. He waited till the next shift kicked off, the warehouse buzzing with its usual chaos. Then he marched to the office where Frank and Eddie Brooks, the lanky sidekick, hunched over a clipboard, plotting their next move. Jim knocked once, sharp and loud, then stepped inside. Frank didn't look up. "What do you want, rookie?" Jim shut the door, turned the lock with a click, and pulled off his glasses. We need to talk. Eddie smirked, leaning back in his chair. New guy's got guts. Jim's voice came out steady, cold as a winter wind. I'm James Carter. Frank blinked, brow furrowing. Who? Jim pulled out his phone, opened the company website, and shoved it in their faces. His own photo stared back from the About Us page, clean-shaven now, but unmistakable. Eddie's smirk vanished like smoke. Frank's face drained to a sickly white. I own this company, Jim said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over them. And I've spent 2 days watching you bleed my people dry. Frank straightened, puffing out his chest. This some kind of joke? Jim's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. You've been docking pay illegally, cutting hours to punish folks, and running a lone racket on my workers. Joke's over. Eddie stammered. Jim sliced through him. Save it. I've heard enough. Frank, your keys. Now. Frank's jaw clenched, his thick fists balling up, but he wasn't dumb enough to swing. He yanked the keyring from his belt and slapped it into Jim's hand, the metal clinking loud in the silence. You're done, Jim said. Both of you. Security's on the way. Frank's face twisted like he'd bitten a lemon, but he grabbed his bag and stormed out, Eddie slinking behind like a whipped pup. Jim exhaled slow, the weight on his chest easing just a notch. He didn't waste a second. Minutes later, he stood in the break room, facing a crowd of wary faces. Tommy near the back, Ray Mitchell by the door, dozens of others clutching coffee cups or half-eaten lunches, waiting for the next blow. Listen up, Jim said, voice firm but warm, cutting through the murmurs. I'm James Carter, the guy who owns this company. I went undercover because I knew something was wrong. What I found, worse than I ever dreamed. The room went quiet, eyes widening. Frank and Eddie are gone, effective now. A stunned pause, then a few cautious smiles broke through. Those illegal pay cuts? Done. If you've had money taken unfairly, and I know plenty of you have, you're getting it back. Full back pay, no exceptions. The murmurs erupted into chatter. Relief, disbelief, a flicker of hope. Jim locked eyes with Tommy, the kid's hands stuffed in his pockets. And you, kid, eat something decent. No more trash. He pulled $200 from his wallet and pressed it into Tommy's trembling hands. I mean it. Tommy's throat bobbed, but he nodded, speechless. One last thing, Jim added, raising his voice over the growing buzz. We're tearing this place down and building it back right. New management, fair schedules, direct line to me. No more fear, no more games. Oh, and every exec in this company is going to spend a week a year working here, starting with me. Jaws dropped. Ray let out a low whistle, a grin tugging at his weathered face. The next morning, the warehouse felt different, lighter, like a storm had blown through and left clear skies. Workers moved with purpose, not dread, their chatter filling the air instead of tense silence. Jim pulled Ray aside, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You've been here 6 years, right? Seen it all. Ray nodded slow, scratching his graying beard. Pretty much. Good, Jim said. Help me fix it. You know this place better than any suit in headquarters. Ray's eyes lit up a bit. Yeah, I can do that. Tommy stuck around too, and when Jim caught him near the loading dock, he asked, You still want to work here? Tommy hesitated, then nodded. Fair hours, fair pay. You got it, Jim said, and the kid's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. Over the next week, Jim rolled up his sleeves, literally, running shifts himself, fixing schedules so no one burned out, setting up an anonymous complaint line that actually got answers. He ordered new forklifts to replace the rattling death traps, added a food stipend. $50 a month per worker, so no one went hungry on shift. Laughter crept into the break room, replacing the dead quiet. Workers started pitching ideas, better ways to stack boxes, shortcuts for sorting, stuff they'd kept quiet under Frank's reign. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Back at headquarters, the execs pushed back hard. Jim sat in the boardroom a week later, facing a table of pinched faces. This is too fast, Jim, one said, a guy in a tie worth more than Tommy's monthly pay. Making us work the floor? Unconventional. Jim leaned forward, voice like iron. Unconventional's what we need. I trusted your systems, and they hit a nightmare. Workers eating trash, execs cashing checks, never again. They squirmed, but a younger woman spoke up. I'm in. We should know what these folks go through. The rest grumbled, but nodded, reluctant, but outvoted. Back at the warehouse, the change took root. Tommy knocked on Jim's door one night, shifting on his feet. I want to move up, logistics, maybe management. The good kind. Jim grinned wide. We'll make it happen, kid. A week later, Jim stood in the warehouse, watching Tommy dig into a roast beef sandwich. Fresh, no trash bin in sight. He'd fixed more than a warehouse. He'd fixed a piece of himself, a piece he'd lost in those boardroom years. But as he scanned the crew, Ray directing a forklift, workers joking over coffee, a question lingered in his gut. Could one man really keep a system this big from rotting again? Hey folks, he said, turning to an imaginary camera with a tired smile. Thanks for sticking with me on this wild ride. If you liked watching Jim take on a mess, hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and drop a comment. I want to hear what you think. More stories like this are coming your way.